here is a law which is above the king and which even he must not break. This reaffirmation of a supreme law and its expression in a general charter is the great work of the Magna Carta, and this alone justifies the respect in which men have held it.
Winston Churchill is describing the Magna Carta, possibly the greatest legal document in history. It was a covenant between King John I and his barons, and was sealed by him in a meadow in Runnymede, England on June 10, 1215. Its revolutionary idea was that a ruler, just like anyone else, is subject to the rule of law. The Magna Carta was conceived as a diplomatic solution to a political crisis, not as a declaration of legal principles. In the short term, it was actually a failure of diplomacy, as King John I broke its terms and caused the Barons' War. However, it was ultimately an enduring success by paving the way for future democracies and inspiring many national constitutions, most notably that of the United States. King John I succeeded his brother, the well-beloved Richard the Lionhearted. However, his people saw a great contrast between the two kings. Richard inspired great loyalty among his people, but John was a terrible ruler who inspired rebellion. John was untrustworthy, lost lands in France that his ancestors had gained, imprisoned people with little reason, and meddled in church affairs. In 1205, Pope Innocent III wanted to make a man called Stephen Langton the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, King John violently disagreed. John's nobles, or barons, were wary of his meddling in this matter, but John ignored their advice.
It was uniquely unlucky, that is to say King John, in that he irritated not simply his barons, but also the church. And the church was undoubtedly at its most powerful stage in the history of Western Europe.
In 1209, the Pope retaliated by excommunicating King John from the church. John was terrified of this prospect. In return for his admission back into the church, he became a vassal to Pope Innocent. As a vassal, John was required to pay the Pope whatever he demanded. John also wanted to regain lands in France that he had lost some years earlier. He was in desperate need of money, so in 1212 he imposed heavy taxes on his barons. John's nobles were livid. After a heated but fruitless confrontation with King John, the barons, with Stephen Langton as mediator, decided to force the king to rule by the old English laws in place before William the Conqueror arrived in England. These demands were recorded in January of 1215 in a document called the Articles of the Barons. King John disregarded this document and continued ruling as before, so the barons decided to take up arms. They captured London in May of 1215. In June, the barons took John by surprise at Windsor, forcing him to agree to a meeting at Runnymede. At Runnymede, King John met the barons' demands and affixed his seal to the Articles of the Barons. In return, the barons renewed their oaths of fealty to the king. The formal rendition of this document was created by the Royal Chancery on July 15th, the original Magna Carta.
What's unusual about Magna Carta in the context of the early 13th century is that its notion of who has legal rights is somewhat broader than what you find in these other charters of liberties in other kingdoms. The people who are presented as having these rights recognized are usually only the great nobles of the kingdom. Magna Carta makes it clear that it extends these rights to all free men in England.
The Magna Carta, literally meaning Great Charter, still remains the root of the English legal and political system. Today, 800 years after this charter was written, the ideas conceived in it are still part of the American Constitution and still apply to most democracies around the world. We can draw parallels between many ideas in the Magna Carta, the US Constitution, and parliamentary democracy. For instance, the separation of the church from government, the establishment of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the civil right to obtain a writ as protection against imprisonment without cause. The guarantee of due process of law to not just higher-ranking nobles, but to all free men. One drawback of this law is that it guarantees a trial, no matter how petty the charge. However, it prevents capricious and random royal action.
Chapter 39, it says that no free man shall be deprived of his liberty without due process of law.
The Constitution of the General Council, now known as Parliament. The Carta also outlines the procedures for summoning the council. The limitation of scutage, a tax paid by nobles in lieu of military service, as John had recklessly levied scutage to fund his campaigns against France. the limitation of dues that barons could exact from their vassals. This was an act of generosity by the barons, sacrificing money from their vassals for the common good of England. Debate in different forms was critical in the development and signing of the Magna Carta. For instance, there was a debate between King John and the Pope over the next Archbishop of Canterbury, which John ultimately lost. Another instance of debate was the argument the king had with his barons over his methods of rule. The barons lost this debate and finally responded with the Articles of the Barons, which became the Magna Carta. Debate, albeit a violent one, also occurred between the barons and King John, as the barons forced the king to appear at the momentous meeting at Runnymede, where he affixed his seal to the document. Diplomacy played a role in resolving debate throughout this process. For instance, the barons, who were often at odds with each other, worked together and with Stephen Langton to draft the Articles of the Barons, which eventually became the Magna Carta. Forced diplomacy occurred when the barons presented King John with the Articles of the Barons. According to the last chapter in the document, the king would lose his support from his barons if he did not sign the document, leaving the king with no option but to acquiesce. The Magna Carta initially was a disastrous failure.
Well, certainly in the short term it was a failure because nobody agreed to it. I mean, one historian has said that it was simply a pause in the dispute between John and some of his nobles.
Pope Innocent saw this uprising by the barons as an insult to his authority, calling the Carta a shameful and demeaning agreement, forced upon the king by violence and fear, and pressured John to ignore the Magna Carta. The barons, too, realizing that John could not be restrained by a mere document, started a war to overthrow him. This war lasted from 1215 to 1217 and became known as the Barons' War. Even if the Magna Carta was a failure at its inception, there is no denying its effects on later Western civilization. The Carta is responsible for the revolutionary idea of a limited monarchy. Several points of the original Magna Carta are still English law today, separating the Catholic Church from the government, delineating the ancient liberties that belong to the City of London, and the right to due process of law. In addition, when American colonists arrived from England, they brought the ideals of the Magna Carta with them. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties, the first legal code to be established by European colonists in America, contains sections that are strikingly similar to chapters of the Carta. In 1638, the colonists of Maryland requested permission from the king to use the Magna Carta as their regional law, but it was denied by the reigning King George I, fearing that he would lose power just like King John. Perhaps the greatest legal document in American history, the United States Constitution, was heavily influenced by the Magna Carta.
5 of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution have their philosophical and legal roots in the Magna Carta.
The U.S. Constitution was in fact drafted by Gouverneur Morris, an experienced and insightful English legal scholar. Both documents separate the government from religion, establish that the punishment for a crime should fit the severity of the crime, and assert that there needs to be sufficient evidence for a person to be either placed on trial or to have their property seized and searched. Both delineate the fact that when a person is tried, they must be tried by a jury. In fact, other national constitutions, including that of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India, trace their roots back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta has been referenced in international law more than once. Eleanor Roosevelt, describing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by the United Nations, said,
"This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere."
The Magna Carta was a huge step forward for human rights around the world. Even though the original document was a failed attempt at diplomacy to resolve contentious debate, it was a huge success in the long run, igniting the fire that is the human rights movement today. Even though many of its chapters were eventually repealed, the fundamental ideas that this charter was a symbol of still thrive today. May the Magna Carta, even though it was an initial failure at diplomacy, be forever remembered as the greatest symbol of human rights the world has known.